You can't park that here." It was a crisp spring morning in the quiet township of Woodpine Valley, nestled between rolling hills, thick forests, and a winding lake that shimmered like a ribbon of glass under the sun. It was a town that had once been nothing more than farmland and cabins, simple, rustic, and unbothered. But over the past decade, the northern edge of the valley had changed. Developers had bought up acres of land and turned them into tightly packed cul-de-sacs filled with identical beige homes, perfectly mowed lawns, and fences that dared not stand an inch higher than regulation. Along with these homes came something far worse than any noisy neighbor or barking dog. The HOA called themselves the Woodpine Lakeside Neighborhood Association, but everyone simply referred to them as the HOA. And at the head of this tyrannical little committee was a woman everyone feared or loathed, sometimes both. Her name was Karen Mulgrave. Karen was the self-appointed queen of regulations. She had a clipboard that never left her side, a walkie-talkie, connected to her personal security patrol, 2 bored teenagers on golf carts, and a voice shrill enough to set off a car alarm. If your trash bin was out 10 minutes past pickup, you'd hear from Karen. If your garden gnome wore a hat too colorful, Karen would issue a written citation. And God help you if your dog barked past 9 p.m. But this story didn't begin with trash cans or gnomes. It began with a boat. The boat that rocked the HOA about 1.5 miles south of the HOA neighborhood lived Jack Brenner, a third-generation rancher who owned nearly 500 acres of land, most of which hugged the bottom curve of Lake Isadora, serene horseshoe-shaped body of water that had been part of his family's estate for over 80 years. Jack was a man in his early 50s with calloused hands, sun-cracked skin, and the kind of quiet strength that only came from waking up before dawn every day of your life. He wasn't flashy. He didn't cause trouble. He kept his cattle healthy, paid his taxes, and minded his own business. But he did enjoy one luxury: fishing. And when the weather was right, Jack would tow his modest aluminum fishing boat down to the edge of his lake, launch it from a gravel ramp he'd built himself, and spend the day gliding peacefully across the water, casting lines and forgetting the world. But things started to change when the HOA Fishing Club discovered Lake Isadora. This is a community lake, sir. It was a Saturday afternoon in early April when it happened. Jack had just finished loading his gear onto his boat and was backing his truck toward the ramp when a bright red Subaru pulled up beside him, nearly clipping the grass. The door flung open and out stormed Karen Mulgrave, wearing a visor, a bright pink tracksuit, and a scowl that could sour milk. She marched up to Jack as if he were trespassing on government land. Without even saying hello, she started barking orders. "You can't park that here," she snapped, pointing at Jack's truck and trailer. Jack blinked, slowly getting out of his cab. "Pardon?" "This is public access," she continued. "And per HOA regulation, boats must be registered with the Lakeside Fishing Committee. That boat doesn't have a permit tag, and your vehicle is blocking the ramp for our club's use." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at the ramp he had personally built a decade ago. "Ma'am, this is my land," Karen scoffed, looking around. "Oh, please. The lake is public property. This is community access. We've been launching from here all season." Jack leaned against his truck, crossing his arms. "You've been using my ramp on my private land to launch into my lake." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't back down. "That's impossible. The HOA approved this as a shared recreation zone. I'll have to write you a citation for unauthorized vehicle storage and unpermitted marine activity." There was a long pause. Then Jack asked calmly, "Do you even know who owns this lake?" Karen puffed her chest, tapping her badge that said HOA Vice Chair and Compliance Officer. "The community," she said firmly. "The people. The OA manages all access points." That's when Jack pulled out a folder from his glove compartment. Inside it were original land surveys, updated county maps, and the title deed to Lake Isadora, signed by the state nearly 60 years ago and passed down through his family. He handed it to her. Karen's face changed slowly as she flipped through the pages. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Then she shoved the folder back into Jack's hands like it had burned her. "You'll be hearing from our legal team," she snapped before stomping back to her car and peeling off scattering gravel. Behind her, like a wild raccoon, word spreads like wildfire over the next few days. Things escalated. Jack began receiving letters, some threatening, some pleading. The HOA's fishing club, which had been illegally using his land for years without his knowledge, begged him to keep access open. But he'd had enough. He installed gates along the gravel path. He posted private property, nitrogen monoxide trespassing signs in bold red letters. He even set up a motion-activated camera just in case someone decided to test him. That's when the retaliation began. Karen, furious at being publicly embarrassed, started a campaign within the HOA to paint Jack as a selfish recluse who was hoarding natural resources and endangering community harmony. She filed noise complaints, trash complaints, even accused him of operating a commercial business without a permit, all of which were laughable and immediately thrown out. But the final straw came 2 weeks later when Jack returned from town and found a notice nailed to a post on his property, an official letter declaring that the HOA had voted to condemn the boat ramp area, citing public necessity and historical community use. That was when Jack called his lawyer. A storm is brewing. Jack wasn't a man who liked courtrooms or lawsuits, but he knew how to stand his ground. With the help of his attorney, he prepared a counteroffensive that no one in the HOA was ready for. He began pulling land records, local zoning laws, tax maps, water usage rights, all of which pointed in one direction. He owned everything: the lake, the ramp, the land the HOA had been casually using for years. In fact, the fishing club's clubhouse, built on a patch of land they thought was part of their park, was partially on his soil. And now Jack was ready to do something about it. The meeting that changed everything. Karen Mulgrave wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. After storming off from her first encounter with Jack Brenner, the rancher who calmly revealed that he owned the lake, the boat ramp, and the land she'd assumed belonged to the community, she'd spent the entire evening in her kitchen, slamming cabinet doors and venting to anyone who'd listen. Her husband, Greg, wisely kept to himself behind the morning newspaper, pretending not to hear her muttering about backwoods squatters and uncooperative cowboys. But Karen wasn't the kind of woman who stopped at ranting. She was a woman of action, misguided, impulsive action. By Monday morning, she had convened an emergency HOA board meeting in the community clubhouse. The room was filled with 30 OA members, mostly retired couples and young professionals who had bought into the promise of a peaceful lakeside neighborhood only to find themselves constantly pulled into Karen's battles. With her infamous clipboard tucked under her arm and a fresh stack of color-coded folders, she took the floor like a general ready for war. She clicked a remote, and a PowerPoint presentation flashed onto the screen at the front of the room. Title read, "Reclaiming Our Community Access: Strategic Solutions for Lakefront Obstruction." "Friends," she began, her voice firm and theatrically emotional, "a terrible injustice has occurred. A private landowner who, mind you, has not contributed to our HOA or shared in the development of this community has declared that our lake is his." A few gasps echoed. An elderly woman with thick glasses muttered, "Isn't that lake public land?" Karen nodded emphatically. "Exactly, or at least it should be. But he's using old deeds and outdated maps to claim ownership. And worse, he's locked our fishing club out of the ramp we've been using for years." An older man in the back raised his hand. "Did we get permission to use that ramp in the first place?" Karen shot him a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We were told it was unclaimed." And possession is 9/10 of the law, is it not? We have built traditions there: community picnics, summer fishing tournaments, youth kayaking classes. Are we going to let one man destroy all of that? The room stirred with uncertain murmurs. Some nodded. Others remained quiet, unsure whether this was a cause worth championing. But Karen knew how to rally a crowd. She spun tales of community sovereignty, natural heritage, and greedy landowners, fanning the flames until even those who had once been neutral began to feel insulted that someone dared to challenge their right to the lake they'd claimed through custom. And so, by the end of that meeting, a resolution was passed unanimously, save for 3 abstentions. The HOA would pursue restoration of access, which included legal action, if necessary. They would also place temporary signs around the boat ramp, claiming it as a community lake access, and hold a press conference next weekend to rally public support. But what Karen didn't realize, what she refused to realize, was that Jack Brenner wasn't just some stubborn landowner. He was a man with deep roots in the county, strong legal representation, and an unshakable understanding of his rights. And he had quietly been preparing for this exact kind of escalation. Ranchers don't bluff. Jack sat in his modest ranch house the night after the HOA's emergency meeting, sipping black coffee while reviewing the final draft of the letter his lawyer had prepared. It was clear, direct, and devastating. The letter detailed every inch of property ownership from county surveyors, complete with legal codes, historical documents, and a record of trespassing violations over the past 2 years, all tied to the HOA Fishing Club's activities. More importantly, it included a formal eviction notice, giving the HOA 14 days to vacate and dismantle their fishing clubhouse, which Jack's latest survey confirmed sat 12 feet over his property line. Jack wasn't a spiteful man. He had no problem with neighbors fishing on the lake or kids playing by the water. But what bothered him was the entitlement. No one had ever asked. No one had ever approached him with respect or gratitude. They just came in, built structures on his land, and assumed it was theirs to rule over. And now their queen was trying to take even more. He folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. The next morning, he drove it straight to the HOA's legal office in town and handed it to the receptionist. No drama. No confrontation. Just facts delivered with calm conviction. And that's when the real war began. The fishing club gets the news by Friday. Word of the letter had reached Karen and the HOA board. The response was swift, but far from effective. The HOA's attorney, a recent law school graduate named Russell, who had more experience in parking violations than land disputes, immediately called a board meeting to assess the damage. "I've reviewed the documents Mr. Brenner submitted," he began, adjusting his tie nervously. "And well, legally speaking, he has a strong case. The lake is entirely within the boundaries of his family's estate. That includes the ramp, the bank, and yes, the land under the fishing club's clubhouse." Karen leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "So what are we paying you for, Russell? Tell us how to fight this." Russell cleared his throat. "We can attempt to challenge it in court, but it would be costly and honestly a losing battle. Your best option is to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Karen snapped. "With a man who thinks he's the king of a lake? Absolutely not." One of the board members, a retired judge named Linda, finally spoke. "Karen, if he's right, then we're the ones who trespassed. And that clubhouse? We built it without permits, without a land survey, and now on someone else's property." Karen waved her hand. "Technicalities. This is about what's fair." But for Jack Brenner, this was never about fairness. It was about boundaries, literal and figurative. And since the HOA refused to recognize either, he was more than ready to enforce them himself. Eviction in progress with the 14-day notice halfway through, Jack began preparing the land around the lake. He hired a crew to install a sturdy gate, at the end of the trail leading from the HOA's development to the lake. He marked his property lines with fresh posts and reflective tape. And most significantly, he posted a formal notice of restricted access, referencing county land laws and warning that further trespassing would result in legal action. Then came the big move. On the 12th day, under cloudy skies and a cool breeze, Jack arrived with a local demolition crew. The fishing clubhouse, a prefab shed that had once been a community project, stood awkwardly at the edge of the lake, half-painted and surrounded by lawn chairs, banners, and faded signs from past events. It was about to be removed. Karen showed up mid-morning, shrieking when she saw the crew begin disassembling the deck. "You can't do this," she shouted, marching up to Jack. "You'll regret this." Jack turned slowly, arms folded. "You've got 2 days left on the eviction notice. I'm just getting started early. We'll sue you. You're welcome to try." That's when one of the workers, a tall man with a handlebar mustache, handed Karen a rolled-up printout. "Full survey, miss. All signed by the county. Office, that little clubhouse of yours, sits 12 feet over his lot line. No permits, no rights." Karen stood in stunned silence as Jack calmly walked past her, helping the workers load planks and posts into the back of a trailer. The community watched from afar, many residents peeking out of windows or standing at the ends of driveways, unsure of whose side to be on, but realizing something big was happening. The HOA had picked a fight, and now they were losing it, one board at a time. The press, the protest, and the past revealed 2 days after the dismantling of the unauthorized fishing clubhouse began. The storm that had been building behind Karen Mulgrave's carefully rehearsed poise finally broke into full-blown spectacle. Unable to accept the humiliation of her authority being undone by a man in muddy boots and flannel, Karen decided that her war with Jack Brenner could not be confined to HOA meetings and legal threats. It needed an audience. So she called the media on a bright Thursday morning, as the final remnants of the HOA fishing clubhouse were being hauled away by the hired crew under Jack's supervision. Karen stood at the head of the walking trail, entrance that once led to the lakefront. She had positioned herself in front of a homemade banner that read, "Save our lake. Stop the rancher takeover." Behind her stood a mix of HOA residents, a few sympathetic neighbors, and a small camera crew from a local news station that had been promised a juicy land rights scandal. Karen, dressed in a powder blue blazer and holding a binder full of exaggerated claims, stepped in front of the camera with rehearsed conviction. She painted Jack Brenner as a land baron, using outdated legal tricks to cut off public access to a beloved community lake, as if he were some villain from a forgotten Western movie. She used words like greedy, unfair, and environmental concern, hoping to inflame the public and rally sympathy. "We have enjoyed this lake for years," she declared passionately. "Children have learned to fish here, elderly couples have spent quiet afternoons by the shore, and now one man wants to claim it all for himself. This is not just about property lines. This is about community. This is about justice." The cameraman nodded as if impressed, while a few residents clapped politely behind her. But they didn't know what was coming, because Jack had already seen the news truck roll up the gravel road hours earlier, and he had prepared for it. Jack's quiet response: Jack had never been one for media appearances. His idea of going public was posting a notice on the bulletin board at the local feed store. But when the news crew showed up, invited by Karen's dramatics, he figured it was time to speak, not in outrage, not with bluster, but with quiet facts. As Karen wrapped up her speech and waved to the camera, Jack walked up the trail from his side of the property, holding a thick binder of his own and wearing the same faded denim shirt he always wore when working the ranch. He wasn't polished, he wasn't flashy. But when he reached the crowd and nodded politely to the reporter, the mood shifted. "Morning," he said. "I'd like to say a few words, if I may." Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, but the reporter turned toward him immediately. This was the other side of the story they were hoping for. Jack didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He opened the binder and began to speak slowly and clearly, showing documents to the camera and to the HOA residents who had gathered. My name is Jack Brenner. I own 527 acres of land, including every inch of Lake Isadora. The lake has been in my family since 1959. Here's the original title deed. Here's the updated survey. Here's the tax record that shows I've paid property taxes on this land, including the lakebed, every year for the past 26 years. He flipped through pages, letting the facts speak louder than any of Karen's theatrics. I didn't build any fences. I didn't call the police. I simply posted signs on my property and asked the HOA to respect it. Instead, I received threats. I was accused of stealing a lake I already owned. And when I asked the fishing club to stop using my boat ramp without permission, I got served with an illegal condemnation notice written by people who don't have the authority to regulate my land. The reporter looked stunned, flipping through Jack's binder on camera. Meanwhile, a few of the residents who had gathered behind Karen began to whisper among themselves, visibly uncomfortable. Jack paused, then added, "And just so you know, I've allowed local kids to fish here for free every summer. I've let people kayak, swim, and picnic. I don't mind sharing. What I mind is being told I have no right to my own land by people who didn't even ask." Silence followed. And then slowly, one of the elderly HOA members turned and walked away from Karen's side, shaking her head. Then another. The crowd was thinning, and with it, Karen's grip on her narrative. But it wasn't over yet. The protest that backfired. Determined to regain control, Karen staged a protest the very next day. Using HOA funds without full board approval, she printed signs, handed out flyers door to door, and even hired a young college activist to lead chants. A dozen people gathered outside the new gate that marked the edge of Jack's land, waving signs and yelling slogans like "Justice for residents" and "Our lake, our rights." Jack didn't come out to argue. Instead, he sat in his truck, watching quietly as sheriff's deputies arrived not to arrest him, but to warn the protesters that they were now trespassing on private property and would be cited if they didn't move to the roadside. Karen screamed foul, claiming freedom of speech, but the officers remained calm and firm. "Your speech is protected," one of them said, "but not on land you don't own." The protest dispersed in under an hour. Karen's fury had reached its boiling point, but Jack hadn't even broken a sweat. The history they didn't know that weekend. A feature ran in the Sunday edition of the local newspaper. It wasn't about an angry HOA or a greedy landowner. It was a profile piece on Jack Brenner, his family's history, the legacy of Lake Isadora, and the deep roots the Brenner Ranch had in the community long before the HOA ever existed. Article told of how Jack's grandfather had dug the original irrigation channels that fed the lake, how the family had allowed local firefighters to draw water from it during a massive wildfire in '87, how Jack's father had refused offers from developers, offers that would have turned the entire lake into luxury condos, because he wanted the land to stay natural, peaceful, and untouched. By Monday morning, everything had changed. Residents who had once supported Karen were now knocking on Jack's door, not to argue, but to apologize. One brought him a homemade pie. Another offered to mow the roadside for free. Some of the HOA board members even held an emergency session, not to plot retaliation, but to vote Karen out as vice chair. The vote passed unanimously. Karen silenced. Karen didn't show her face for 3 days after that meeting. Her once busy email chain and group chats fell silent. She was no longer patrolling lawns or issuing citations. The HOA newsletter that once opened with her glowing from the desk of the chairwoman column was missing entirely. And Jack? Jack went fishing. He didn't throw a party. He didn't rub anything in. He simply got up one morning, hitched his boat to his truck, and drove down to the lake. He cast his line out into the still water, surrounded by quiet and something even better, respect. Because when all the shouting stopped, and the cameras left, and the dust settled, only the truth remained. And Jack Brenner, the rancher everyone underestimated, had let the truth do all the talking. The lawsuit, the leak, and the last straw. It had been nearly 3 weeks since the fishing clubhouse was torn down, and the noise surrounding the incident had finally begun to fade. Most of the residents in the HOA community had come to accept the outcome. Some still felt resentment, but even they knew better than to challenge Jack Brenner again. Not after the public spectacle that had turned him from a quiet landowner into something of a local folk hero. Still, there remained one person who had not forgiven, not forgotten, and certainly not moved on. Karen Mulgrave. Though she had been voted out as vice chair, Karen still retained a seat on the HOA board, and she used that position to plan her next move from the shadows. She stopped speaking at meetings, stopped organizing events, and stopped walking around with her clipboard. But beneath that silence was something brewing. Something she believed would turn the tide in her favor. A lawsuit. Karen had quietly retained a different attorney, one with more experience in property disputes and aggressive tactics. This time, she wasn't going after the land itself. She was going after the public perception of ownership. Her new plan was to challenge the easement boundaries around Lake Isadora and argue that, despite Brenner owning the lake, the public had established a right of usage over time, a rare but sometimes effective legal maneuver. Her attorney described it as a long shot, but Karen didn't care. She wanted a fight, and now she had a weapon. The lawsuit was filed quietly but strategically. It claimed that the community had maintained access to the lakefront for over a decade, had made good faith improvements to the area, and had used it openly without challenge. It accused Jack of abusing property laws to restrict public access to what had become a shared resource. The document was filled with loaded language: greedy landholder, restrictive and discriminatory conduct, unreasonable blockade of public land. Jack received the notice on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked almost apologetic. He opened the envelope slowly, read every word, and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. He wasn't surprised. Disappointed, yes, but not surprised. He made 2 calls. The first was to his lawyer, the same one who had helped him prepare the original eviction notices. The second was to the county recorder's office, because Jack had an idea. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to end this for good. The whispered past of Lake Isadora. Most of the younger homeowners in the HOA didn't know the full history of Lake Isadora. To them, it was a pretty backdrop for barbecues and fishing. But to the older folks, the ones who had lived in the area, long before the HOA existed, it was a place woven into local legend. The lake had once been part of a much larger homestead, originally purchased during the Depression by Jack's great-grandfather. The land had never been public. It was dug, dammed, and managed entirely by the Brenner family for agricultural purposes. In the 1970s, the lake's recreational use became popular among nearby ranchers, and Jack's father allowed a few locals to fish under informal handshake agreements. But those privileges were never guaranteed, and they were never extended to people who didn't ask. Karen's entire case hinged on the claim that the lake had become public by default use, but that argument would fall apart if Jack could prove that all past access was by permission, not assumption, and he could. That same week, Jack visited the county archives and pulled a copy of his father's signed permission slips, dozens of handwritten letters dating back to 1974, each one granting named individuals access to fish, boat, or picnic at the lake for set periods of time. Not only were the permissions conditional, they also included clauses about revocation and boundaries. Some of the names on those slips were still living in town, And Jack personally visited 2 of them, retired locals who vividly remembered being told they had access as long as you respect the fence. Jack made photocopies, notarized statements, and filed a counterclaim against Karen's lawsuit. Malicious prosecution and willful misrepresentation of property access. He wasn't going to let this spiral into years of litigation. He was going to show once and for all that facts, history, and law were on his side. The HOA's internal eruption, the news of Karen's latest lawsuit, didn't stay secret for long. Within a few days, the HOA board members began receiving questions from residents who were alarmed at hearing Jack might be dragged into court. One resident, a former paralegal, got hold of the court filing and leaked it online. The community message board lit up. "What is Karen doing? Didn't we lose this fight already? I thought Jack owned the land. Is she trying to bankrupt him now? We're going to be sued back, aren't we?" The board was flooded with complaints, and several members called for a special meeting to vote on whether the HOA should distance itself from Karen's legal actions. During that meeting, held in a packed clubhouse, where residents filled every chair and stood along the walls, Karen tried to defend herself. "I'm doing this for all of us," she said, voice tight, hands gripping the podium. "If we let this man take everything, what's next? He'll build fences across the shoreline. He'll charge us to walk near the water." But by now, the charm had worn thin. People no longer clapped when she spoke. They folded their arms, they muttered, they shook their heads. One of the board members, Linda, who had once served as a municipal judge, spoke with cool precision. "We're not supporting this lawsuit. It's not sanctioned by the board, and we refuse to expose our association to liability for one member's personal vendetta." Karen stood alone as the vote passed to officially disassociate the HOA from the case. And when she turned to look at her neighbors, not one of them met her eyes. The leak 3 days later. Karen's world collapsed. A confidential HOA internal document surfaced online, leaked by a disillusioned board member, revealing that Karen had authorized the construction of the fishing clubhouse years earlier by forging a permit application. The document included her email trail, where she claimed the land was unregulated and no known owner listed in the tax record, despite having been informed otherwise by a junior HOA employee at the time. The leak went viral in the community and was picked up by a local blog. Within hours, the story spread. Karen had knowingly built on someone else's land, lied about it, and then tried to frame the actual landowner as the villain. That night, Karen's front lawn was egged. 2 board members called for her to resign completely from the HOA. She refused. Then someone posted a video of her screaming at the demolition crew weeks earlier, edited alongside footage of Jack calmly presenting his land deeds. The internet turned it into a meme, HOA Karen versus Cowboy Justice. It had 300,000 views in 2 days. Karen's reputation was in shambles. The judge's gavel. The hearing was brief and devastating. Jack's attorney presented signed letters from past residents, notarized testimonies, and verified county records proving every access point had been by explicit permission. The judge barely needed an hour to review the files. He dismissed the HOA's claim of implied community access, ruling it had no merit. Then, to everyone's shock, he agreed to hear Jack's countersuit, a civil case for defamation, property damage, and legal costs resulting from Karen's false claims. The judge's final remarks were clear. This court finds the plaintiff's behavior not only unsubstantiated but willfully deceitful. Karen was left staring straight ahead, pale and silent. The gavel came down. Fallout, forgiveness, and the final offer. The day after the courtroom ruling, a heavy hush fell across the Woodpine Lakeside community. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed peace. It was the kind that followed impact. Like the stillness after a tree falls in the woods, or after thunder finally stops rolling across the hills. The residents, many of whom had been vocal supporters of HOA initiatives for years, were now left reckoning with the consequences of following a leader who had used community spirit as a shield for personal ego. Karen Mulgrave's fall wasn't just a public embarrassment. It was the kind of implosion that left trust fractured, friendship strained, and the entire HOA board scrambling to recover its legitimacy. On the morning following the court decision, HOA Board President Elliot Marsh called a public town hall meeting to address the residents. The meeting, held at the community clubhouse, was packed. Rows upon rows of folding chairs were filled, and more people stood along the walls than sat. A thick tension hung in the air. People weren't just angry. They felt betrayed. It was one thing to lose access to a lake. It was another to find out that the woman leading their neighborhood had knowingly lied, misused funds, and brought legal ruin to their doorstep. Elliot stepped up to the podium slowly, his gray beard and tired eyes giving him the look of a man who had aged 5 years in 1 month. "I want to start," he said, voice low but steady, "by offering this community a sincere apology. We failed you. I failed you." The room remained quiet, many faces stony, others filled with quiet sadness. Karen Mulgrave has been officially removed from all HOA responsibilities, and as of this morning, she is no longer a board member in any capacity. We are also launching a full audit of HOA spending, including all legal expenses and community funds tied to the now demolished fishing clubhouse. A few heads nodded. Others whispered, "And for those of you who fear we may be sued back, let me be honest with you. We already have been. Mr. Jack Brenner has filed a civil countersuit, and though the HOA as a whole is not named, the board has agreed to enter settlement negotiations in good faith to prevent further damage to our community." That last part caused a stir. Whispers turned to light murmurs, and a few people even stood up to ask if their dues would go toward legal fees. Elliot nodded solemnly, answering each question with the transparency that had been sorely missing during Karen's reign. But then, just as the meeting seemed to reach its lowest point, the unexpected happened. The doors to the clubhouse opened, and in walked Jack Brenner. Jack's unexpected offer. Jack hadn't come in with a lawyer. He wasn't dressed in his courtroom flannel or riding boots. Instead, he wore a clean button-down shirt, jeans, and a weathered leather jacket. He walked straight down the center aisle of the clubhouse without looking to either side. And when he reached the front, Elliot, visibly surprised, stepped aside without hesitation. Jack turned to face the crowd. He didn't need a microphone. His voice was clear, his tone quiet but firm. "I didn't come here today to gloat, or to demand money, or to punish anyone." He paused. "I came because I've lived in this town my whole life, and I don't want to see it torn apart because of pride, anger, or mistakes." Some of the tension in the room seemed to ease. People listened more closely. "I understand that not everyone here knew what was going on. A lot of you were misled. A lot of you thought you were doing the right thing. I've never had a problem with neighbors wanting to enjoy the lake. My problem was being told I had no say in it, that I didn't belong, that someone else could make decisions on my land without even knocking on my door." There were nods now, heads lowered in quiet guilt. "I'm not asking for apologies, but I am offering something." That made the room stir again. Jack took a folded paper from his jacket and held it up. "This is a formal agreement I've drawn up, reviewed by my attorney. It offers limited access to Lake Isadora for community use, including fishing, kayaking, and picnics, but under clear rules. No permanent structures. No HOA control. No entitlement. You want to use it, you ask. You get permission in writing. And if that's too much to ask, then you're welcome to enjoy the walking trail that stops at the edge of your neighborhood." He placed the paper on the table beside the podium and turned to leave, but paused. "Don't mistake kindness for weakness. I'm offering this because I want peace, not because I owe it." and not because I forgot what was done. Then, without another word, Jack walked out. The community's reckoning by the time the sun set that evening. The community boardroom was alive with debate. Jack's offer had split the HOA into two camps, those who believed his gesture was a chance to rebuild bridges, and those who still clung to the idea that the HOA had been wronged. "I say we take the offer," said Linda, the retired judge. "It's more than fair. He didn't have to offer us anything after everything that happened." "We shouldn't have to beg just to fish," countered Barry, a grumpy board member who had once supported Karen. "That lake should be ours." "It was never ours," another resident snapped. "You just believed whatever Karen told you." Because it felt convenient, the debate raged on for hours. But by midnight, a vote was taken. 84% of HOA members approved the agreement Jack had offered. And the next morning, Elliot Marsh personally drove to the ranch and knocked on Jack's door to deliver the signed copy. Jack accepted it with a nod and invited Elliot in for coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, looking out across the lake as a gentle breeze stirred the water. "You didn't have to do this," Elliot said. "I know," Jack replied. "But maybe it's time people remembered how to knock before they take." Karen's isolation while the rest of the community moved on. Karen Mulgrave became a ghost. She no longer attended meetings. She avoided her neighbors. Her once immaculate front lawn began to brown at the edges, and her garden gnomes disappeared one by one, likely packed away out of shame. Word spread that she and her husband were planning to sell the house and move to another state. No one begged them to stay. In fact, more than a few people said quietly that it was for the best. Karen's downfall had become a cautionary tale, reminder that power, when unchecked, can rot from within. And Jack? He went back to ranching. He went back to fishing. And every now and then, when a neighbor came by with a respectful request to use the lake, he smiled, nodded, and handed them a copy of the agreement. "Just bring the fish back if you catch. Anything worth sharing," he'd say. And for the first time in a long time, peace truly returned to Woodpine Valley, not because someone won, but because someone chose to lead with humility when they had every right to demand vengeance. The revival of Woodpine Valley months passed, and the once scarred relationship between the Woodpine, Lakeside community and Jack Brenner began to transform into something neither side had expected: mutual respect. The lake that had once been the center of controversy, finger-pointing, and legal tension was now beginning to take on a new life, not under the grip of entitlement, but under a quiet and collaborative understanding. The paper Jack had submitted, the one offering conditional, respectful access, had done more than allow people to fish again. It had reminded them that generosity, when not abused, could become the root of unity. It started subtly. One Saturday morning, a father and son who lived in the neighborhood parked their bikes at the edge of Jack's land. Instead of just walking down to the lake, they waited respectfully. When Jack noticed them from the far end of the dock where he was untangling an old net, he waved them over. The father walked up holding a laminated copy of the signed agreement in one hand and a tackle box in the other. "We read everything," he said. "We'll follow the rules. Just wanted to say thanks." Jack smiled. "Enjoy yourselves. She's biting early this season." The boy grinned and ran ahead, his small fishing rod bobbing behind him. That simple exchange began a chain reaction. Other families followed suit, slowly and humbly. Some brought baked goods to the ranch as thanks. Others offered help around the property. Jack, never one to ask for favors, accepted with a silent nod and an amused smirk. Before long, something strange began to happen. The invisible walls between the ranch and the HOA began to disappear. Not with paperwork, but with people. From lawsuit to lake day by spring. The idea came from Linda, the retired judge who had become the de facto head of the HOA after Karen's disgraceful exit. At a board meeting, she stood and proposed something that no one had dared suggest since the conflict ended. I think we should host a joint event with Jack, a formal lake day, not to pretend like nothing happened, but to acknowledge how far we've come. No HOA speeches, no banners, no nonsense. Just families, the lake, and the man who made it all possible. A brief silence followed. Then, surprisingly, Barry, the former Karen supporter, spoke up. If he's okay with it, I'd help set it up. Linda looked around the room. Then we'll ask. Respectfully. If he says no, we walk away. So a letter was written. Signed by every board member. Delivered by hand. Jack read it slowly, then folded it once and slipped it into his back pocket. Fine, he said, but I picked the date. And no one puts up one of those inflatable arches. This is a lake, not a carnival. And so the first official Woodpine Ranch Lake Day was born. The day it all changed. When the day arrived, it wasn't flashy. There were no plastic wristbands, no stage performances, no long-winded announcements. There were just people. Good people. Families with picnic baskets, teenagers setting up hammocks between the trees, older couples bringing their folding chairs to watch the sun sparkle on the water. And Jack was there, not as a gatekeeper, but as a quiet host walking the shoreline, checking the grill someone had rolled out from the back of their truck, nodding in approval when someone handed him a cold soda. There were little signs of change everywhere. A group of teenagers who had once ignored Jack's posted signs now carried garbage bags, cleaning up the trail after every group passed through. A local carpenter had offered to build a small dock extension using salvaged wood from the old fishing club, approved by Jack, of course, and placed within proper property lines. Everything was being done right this time. Not because anyone forced them to, but because they wanted to earn back something they had nearly lost forever: dignity and trust. Around midday, Linda climbed up on a stump near the shore and clapped for attention. Conversations dimmed. Children paused mid-run. And all eyes turned toward her. I promise no speeches, she said with a warm smile. But I'd be lying if I didn't say a few words. Jack raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. This lake used to divide us. Not because of water or fish or rules, but because of pride. Some of us thought we were owed something just because we were used to having it. Some of us forgot that ownership comes with responsibility, and that asking permission doesn't make you weak, it makes you honorable. I want to thank Jack Brenner for reminding us of that. Not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a lesson we'll never forget. A round of genuine applause followed. Jack gave a small wave and muttered under his breath, "Didn't even yell at anyone today. Not bad." Karen's letter as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange over Lake Isadora. Linda approached Jack quietly with a sealed envelope. "This came a few days ago," she said, "from Karen." Jack didn't say anything at first. He held the envelope, turned it in his hand, then finally opened it. The letter wasn't long, and it wasn't filled with excuses. "Jack, I was wrong. About the land, about the lake, about you. I let my ego lead when I should have listened. I lost a lot, but I deserve to. I hope someday I can come back to this community and not be remembered for what I did wrong, but for how I tried to make peace. Sincerely, Karen Mulgrave." Jack folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "She was a damn fool," he said, "but I've known worse. Do you want us to keep it quiet?" Linda asked. "Nah, let people know. Let 'em see that even the worst of us can change if they're honest about it." The lake's future. By summer, Jack had formalized a new plan. Working with a local nonprofit and the HOA board, he created a lake stewardship program where volunteers from the neighborhood could help maintain the trails, clean the shoreline, and ensure safe and respectful usage. It wasn't a contract, it was a handshake system. But this time, people understood the meaning of that gesture. He even hired a young man from the community, a teenager who once tagged the fence line as a prank to help with fishing classes for local kids. The boy showed up every weekend, early and eager, proving that sometimes the best way to fix a mistake isn't punishment. It's giving someone the chance to do better. Jack didn't need praise. He didn't want a statue or a plaque or a headline. What he wanted was quiet and order and a world where people respected what wasn't theirs. And slowly, patiently, that's exactly what began to grow in Woodpine Valley. The lake was still his, always would be. But now, for the first time in decades, it felt like everyone belonged there, not because of rights, not because of claims, but because of earned trust and mutual care. And when Jack stood at the end of the dock one warm evening, looking out over the calm water as a dozen fishing lines danced under the setting sun, he finally said aloud what he'd only thought before. Maybe this ain't just a lake after all. Maybe it's a second chance. Legacy on the water. The soft days of late summer fell over Woodpine Valley like a well-worn blanket, warm, familiar, and touched with quiet meaning. The controversy that had once stirred the town like a storm had now faded into a memory, its sharp edges worn down by time, community growth, and a surprising current of forgiveness. The lake, once a battlefield of ownership and ego, had matured into the center of a new kind of life. Where arguments once echoed, now laughter took their place. Where boundaries had been drawn, bridges, real and emotional, were being quietly built, plank by plank. Jack Brenner could feel it, even if he never said it out loud. He noticed it in the little things. In the way kids left folded notes on his porch, asking for weekend fishing permission instead of just showing up. In how the trail bordering his ranch was always spotless now, the result of volunteer teams that checked on it daily without being asked. In the way parents walked slower near the lake, letting their kids ask questions, tell stories, and simply be. The land hadn't changed, but the people had. And that made all the difference. That September, something happened that would seal the lake's future forever, not in court papers or HOA meetings, but in the words of a dying man who still had one last story to tell. The letter from Harold Brenner arrived on a Sunday. A heavy, yellowed envelope, worn at the corners and sealed with a thick red wax stamp, his father's old ranch seal. Jack sat at the breakfast table when he opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. His father's sharp but steady penmanship filled the page like the lake filled the valley, unrushed, full of gravity. Jack, if you're reading this, then I'm long gone, and I didn't get to see what the lake became. That's all right. I never needed the world to remember my name, just to treat the land like it mattered. I know people will try to take it. People always do. But don't fight them with fists. Fight them with history. With the truth. With quiet, calm, unmovable strength. That's what the lake teaches us. And if someday you find it in your heart to let the world back in, to open the gate not just to those who ask, but to those who've learned it, then do it, son. Do it on your terms. But know this, the land doesn't belong to anyone. We just take care of it while we're here. Yours always, Dad. Jack held the letter for a long time. He didn't cry. Not because he wasn't moved, but because the words had already lived inside him long before they were spoken. His father had taught him everything he knew. And now, even in death, he had handed Jack the last key to something deeper than legacy purpose, the stewardship trust. 2 weeks after receiving the letter, Jack made another quiet visit to the county office. But this time, he wasn't bringing evidence. He was bringing a plan. He met with a land conservation advisor and a nonprofit liaison. And over the course of several closed-door sessions, Jack began setting into motion something few expected. The formal creation of the Brenner Lake Stewardship Trust. Under the agreement, Jack would remain the primary steward and legal owner of Lake Isadora for the rest of his life. But after he passed, the land would be entrusted to a nonprofit that protected natural landmarks from development and misuse. The lake would never be sold, never paved over, never auctioned. It would be eternally preserved. But the biggest surprise came in the fine print. He named the Woodpine Lakeside community as the co-beneficiary of the trust, granting them conditional access and partnership in the lake's long-term care. Elliot Marsh, the HOA president, nearly dropped the contract when Jack showed it to him. "You're giving the lake ... To us?" he asked, wide-eyed. "No," Jack said calmly. "I'm giving the lake to everyone. But you get to help take care of it. If you've earned that, of course." That evening, a new kind of celebration broke out, not just because of what Jack was giving, but because of what it meant. After all the anger, the lawsuits, the lies, the silence, and the struggle, he was still choosing unity. Karen's returned 6 months later, just as spring was blooming across the valley and wildflowers began lining the lakeside once more. A familiar car drove up to the edge of the gravel path outside Jack's gate. The woman who stepped out of it no longer wore designer heels or carried a leather-bound folder. She was dressed plainly, carrying only a small, reusable bag and a pair of folding chairs. Karen Mulgrave had returned. She walked up the trail slowly, looking older and softer than before, her once haughty posture replaced by a kind of open humility. She didn't knock on the door. Instead, she stood quietly at the edge of the trail, waiting for Jack to notice her. He did. From his porch, he watched for a moment, then walked down the steps with the same steady gait he always had. The air between them was thick with old history tension, pain, and quiet reckoning. Karen spoke first. "I won't stay long. I just ... wanted to see the lake, if that's okay." Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman who had tried to evict his boat or sue him in court, but someone who had been humbled by the truth and had come back, not to reclaim, but to ask for peace. He nodded. "You can stay. There's a good spot by the cypress trees. Less wind." She smiled faintly. "Thank you." And that was all. She walked away down the trail, unfolded her chair, and sat in silence, watching the water. Just one person among many now, equal, quiet, learning. Years later the years rolled on, and Jack Brenner grew older as the lake remained timeless. Children who once watched their parents argue about fences were now leading nature walks for younger kids. Teens who once feared asking Jack for access were now his assistants, maintaining the trails and watching over the stewardship signs that mark every bend of the water's edge. And the HOA, once a fractured and contentious body, had transformed into something useful, no longer enforcing meaningless rules, but helping organize lake cleanups, educational events, and shared community celebrations. No one forgot what had happened. The scars remained, but they had become reminders of how not to treat each other. And in that, there was wisdom. Jack, now in his late 60s, still walked the dock every evening. He didn't fish as often anymore. He didn't need to. Sometimes, he just watched the water reflect the sky and felt, deep in his bones, that something beautiful had been preserved, not just the land, but the values that surrounded it. On the 10th anniversary of the Stewardship Trust, a small wooden sign was posted at the lake entrance. It read, "Lake Isadora, this land was never conquered, only cared for. This water was never owned, only shared. In memory of those who protected it, and in honor of those who learned how to."